president on the line.
I know, I just felt like, wow, that speech was fucking powerful.
Basically blew the lights.
Yeah.
That was really good. Thank you very much, Francesca. Yeah, that was brilliant. Obviously very hard to follow, so that's a challenge to him. Our next speaker is Jeremy Corbyn MP, who I'll just say is probably one of the biggest allies of the student movement. He's there with us, whether it's fighting deportations at London Met or it's voting against increased tuition fees. He's been an absolute hero and a very long-time friend of the student movement. So, Jeremy.
Thank you, Aaron. It's a pleasure to speak alongside you, and I think you do a fantastic job on behalf of the NUS. I wish all NUS presidents could get up to half your ability. I'm talking historically now. I think you know what I mean. If you had to measure the level of activity that's going on by looking at my diary over the past 30 years, because I've been involved in politics a very long time, what you'd see is that the current time, ever since this coalition government came into office, ever since they started the austerity programme in summer 2010, there's been an incredible increase in a massive diversity of activity, of opposition to cuts, opposition to wars, in favour of environment and sustainability, a whole range of things. And it's not a competition. It's not a competition between them because they're all broadly heading in exactly the same direction, and that's why I absolutely welcome this student assembly against austerity, because I see that as part of a wider campaign that we're all essentially part of if we want to live in a better world and a more decent society. And I have to say, in opening, I thought the invitation to join Unite the Union is a really good one, and I think that Unite, as establishing itself as a community-based union, almost on a parallel with the Latin American social unions, I think is a very, very important and very significant step forward. So many people now work on 0 hours contracts, several part-time jobs, very short time in a particular employment, that sadly the possibility of moving into a cafe or takeaway place or something like that, getting it organised and getting yourself some security in that sense is often very, very difficult. But at least if we build up a whole cohort of people that are members of Unite as a community-based organisation, at least they've got membership of a union, they've got some degree of backing and some degree of support, and it strengthens the trade union movement as a whole. So I think it's something that Unite should be commended for, and I think it's a really, really good step forward. There is sometimes in our enthusiasm to put on events, we don't necessarily all look at the calendar very carefully, and I'm as guilty as that as anybody else, because today there are 3 very good events on. We have the Marxism of the 21st Century this morning up at the Marx Memorial Library. We've got this excellent event on here today, and we've got the class conference on at the TUC Centre. Is it a shame they're all at the same time? In one way, yes, but another way, it's a sign of how strong opposition is to what is going on at the present time. And the workshops that have been held here today, I just want to draw attention to 3 of them because I think they're particularly important. The one that was held on rise against the racist scapegoating is absolutely crucial and very important. The new immigration bill that's before the House of Commons at the present time is a really terrifying and nasty piece of legislation. I've said that about almost every immigration bill as long as I can remember, but this one is almost on a new plane because of the way it, by transference, makes every small landlord an immigration officer, every bank clerk an immigration officer, and it's a sort of feeding into the xenophobia of the Daily Mail and others that somehow or other immigration is the biggest problem this country faces. Ask yourself the question, if there had been no substantial migration to the UK since the Second World War, what kind of country would we live in? What kind of living standard would we have? What kind of transport, education, health, engineering, science industries would we have in this country? I think we all know the answer to that. We all know what a lower standard of living we'd have, what a worse country it would be, and what a cultural monolith it would be compared to what London and certainly all of our major cities are. So I don't think we need to go around apologising for immigration into this country. We need to go around saying what a huge benefit it has been to everybody. Very pleased when we launched the campaign against xenophobia. Ideal title, MAX, Movement Against Xenophobia. Couldn't be simpler. Easier than anything else to say. And then you add up not just what's happening in this country with the sort of steady drip of the media, then look at what's happened in France, Germany, Netherlands, Scandinavian countries, and you see patterns that are broadly similar in terms of xenophobia. But in the case of France, hats off to all those students that immediately walked out of classes and lectures when that young student was taken off a bus and they attempted to deport her. Well done. But then look at the other side of it. All this movement that's going on, the xenophobic movement across Europe, isn't that in part the responsibility of those that are now complaining that they're worried about the numbers of very poor victims of war, oppression, poverty, who are dying in the Mediterranean or the Atlantic trying to escape from that? It's all very well, Manuel Barroso and others, turning up at Lampedusa with crocodile tears when they themselves have talked endlessly about the need for Europe to defend its frontiers. Naval vessels in the Mediterranean preventing migrants getting through is a blockade. It is resulting in the deaths of a very large number of people. The Nobel Literature Prize winners of 100 years' time will be writing stories about how my family got through the blockade in order to make a new life in Europe. Sadly, thousands have already died. 20,000 have died trying to make that crossing of the Mediterranean. We need to factor that into our human approach to the issues of living standards, politics and economics all across Europe. There's a couple of other things I want to mention before Erin grabs at my sleeve and forces me to sit down very quickly. Education and War seminar, excellent, because what we're doing there is pointing out that if this country has got £30 billion to spend on just 2 wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and now proposing to spend £100 billion on developing the Trident nuclear missile system, then they can hardly claim that the welfare budget is ballooning out of control, can they? What is ballooning out of control is the stupidity of spending that amount of our resources on nuclear weapons, our very own weapons of mass destruction. If we didn't do that, we could invest an awful lot more in high-quality engineering jobs and high-quality engineering for a sustainable future rather than a destructive future, and we could begin to learn the lessons, the very important lessons of the Syria vote in Parliament, that this country no longer has the stomach for global reach and wars all over the world. Let's turn it round. One of housing. I represent Islington North, the inner city constituency, and I'm very proud to represent London Met University campus in my constituency, or at least most of it, and I know my way around every picket line at London Met University. Mark, thank you for coming along today. And I think we should say hats off to the NUS branch at London Met, UCU and Unison branches for their very close working relationship and the way that we fought back against the removal of the Tier 4 status, we fought back against job losses and fought back against all the cuts in courses that have taken place. London Met has provided an opportunity for people who wouldn't otherwise have been able to get into higher education, to get a degree and get an education. Well done, our friends and members who support London Met University. We're going to be there with them. Thank you, Mark, for coming along today. Housing is the biggest issue that I face as a local MP. 40% of my community live in council or housing association properties. Less than 30% are owner-occupiers, one of the lowest figures in the whole country. The remaining 35% live in the private rented sector. Largely unregulated, largely very expensive, largely insecure, and often very badly maintained with very limited tenure periods. And so that if a tenant gets a 6-month tenancy and have the temerity to complain about the conditions they're living in, they find their 6-month tenancy is not renewed. If there's the slightest effect of their residence in the place during those 6 months. They're likely to lose their deposit and their rent advance. They're also being asked to pay ludicrous amounts of money for search fees and things like that by the agents. It's past time we had strong regulation of all letting agencies, registration of all landlords, good quality energy and environmental standards in all private rented accommodation, and much longer tenancies of at least 5 years guaranteed as a minimum, so that people have some security when they live in them. But that is not enough, and in a private member's bill I've introduced, and I hope that the anti-austerity movement will get behind it, we need control of the rents so we have a fair rent situation, particularly in London. Otherwise, the social cleansing of central London of ordinary people, ordinary working class people, will go on, and London will begin to represent Manhattan, with the poor living in the Bronx and travelling into work in London. If we want to save this city, we've got to regulate the private rented sector from the greed of the landlord and the private rented system in this country. It's a campaign that has to be fought alongside the demand for the construction of a lot more council housing. The two things are not mutually exclusive, they go together. In conclusion, we have to also look forward about what we want to achieve in our society. I've spent my life defending the whole principle of a welfare state, a state that guarantees everyone against poverty, everyone against destitution, everyone against homelessness, everyone against not getting any medical care when they need it. Defend the principle of the National Health Service, healthcare free at the point of use as a human right. Defend the welfare state that is supposed to protect people against destitution. Every time the Daily Mail and the others run a campaign against benefit scroungers, welfare scroungers, ballooning welfare bill and all the rest of it, somebody else ends up sleeping on the streets who ought to have enough income to get a roof over their head. Somebody else commits suicide because of an ATOS interview they've been through. Somebody else's life chances are destroyed. Some other children's life chances are destroyed by the poverty and the lack of support for them to sustain a decent living. There is something good about saying we want to live in a society where everyone is free from destitution. We want that for ourselves. We want that for everybody else. And in doing that, we have to stand up against the economics of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the European Central Bank and our own government, which say there is a way forward by creating greater wealth for the richest people so they might spend a bit and it will trickle down. It's not new. It was tried out in Latin America by General Pinochet and others in the 1970s and 1980s. It was tried out in Africa in the 80s and 90s. The result? Landless people being driven into big cities all over Africa to occupy shanty towns on the edges and try and get by and survive. The result is a greater gap between the richest and the poorest, greater violence in society, and an awful lot of lost opportunities for young people. The wealth is there to share it out. And I absolutely agree with the points that were just being made by Francesca about sustainability and growth. The issue isn't how much quicker the economy can grow. The issue is how much better we can share out the resources and wealth that we have so that we eliminate poverty and eliminate excessive, obscene levels of personal wealth held by about 1% of the population that seem to have such an enormous control over what our government does. Sustainability is not an antithesis to what people want to achieve in life. It's the very opposite. Our movement against austerity is pointing the way to defending the good points that's been achieved in this country since the end of the Second World War, not allowing ourselves to descend into this horror of free market capitalism, which is what the Tories, Liberal Democrat coalition actually want to achieve, and forcing the unions and the Labour Party to move to a position where they actually defend a coherent and cohesive society rather than allowing it to be destroyed by the way this coalition and the European banking system is operating at the present time. The lights have come on. We are brighter. We are stronger. We are strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Obviously, I don't know how you managed to cope in a parliament filled with such awful, awful people.